Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second Tanker and IFKF WKA CME program. This is a joint effort of the IFKF WKA and the Tanker Foundation. A few words about IFKF WKA. We were formed in 1999, and recently we had a transformation into the International Federation of Kidney Foundations World Kidney Alliance after SF took over as our president of the IFKF WKA. I would just like to tell you briefly that Dr. SF is also heading the Hong Kong Kidney Foundation, and he is a well-known nephrologist, and he has battled COVID and a lot of other problems in Hong Kong as far as health is concerned, and I think he's still battling it now. So we are very blessed and lucky to have him as our president. Tanker Foundation is a foundation for the underprivileged with kidney ailments, founded by Dr. Georgie Abraham, who's here with us today. And Dr. Georgie, it was his vision and mission and all our team efforts that formed Tanker Foundation. And right now we help 700 patients. We do 7,000 dialysis, and we also do screening and awareness programs. Today, we decided that we would also form a CME group with an executive committee. And two of our members today are going to be part of this CME program. So we have Dr. Arpana Iyengar, who's a professor, Department of Pediatric Nephrology, St. John's National Academy of Health Sciences in Bangalore. And we have Dr. Gopalakrishnan, who is a professor of internal medicine, nephrology. He's in Madras Medical College. Dr. Georgie will say a few more words about our very eminent speakers today. Dr. Gopalakrishnan is going to talk about kidney transplant in the underprivileged, and Dr. Arpana will be talking to us about kidney transplant in children. A few words about IFKF. We want to promote kidney health all over the world. And with SF's help and CAM's help, we have really made a lot of progress in the past couple of years. I will, of course, get SF to tell you a lot more towards the end of the program. So I just want to say welcome to all of you. Thank you to all our exec members. Thank you to Tanker Foundation. Thank you to IFKF WKA. And of course, thank you very much to Kausalya, who's our coordinator, our manager, and our big enabler with the IFKF WKA. And of course, to Priya also, who's here with us today. So Dr. Georgie, I would ask you to introduce the speakers and let us get into the program straight away. Thank you.
Yeah. Good evening. On behalf of Tanker Foundation and IFKF, we have the CME program today, and we have two eminent speakers. They are one, Professor Gopalakrishnan. Professor Gopalakrishnan is the head of the Department of Nephrology and Transplantation at the Government Medical College Hospital in Chennai. And his clinical work, his academic work, and research is well known to all of them. Dr. Gopalakrishnan has trained many young nephrologists who are all over Tamil Nadu, and they are spilling over to other parts of the country. Gopalakrishnan is known for his affability and also his humility and his ability to have people under him to do excellent clinical work. And I have been associated with Gopalakrishnan for many years, and he received the American Society of Nephrology award last year for his excellent work. So I have been with him in writing and doing research papers and also textbooks in nephrology. And it's a great privilege to have Dr. Gopalakrishnan speaking on kidney transplantation in adults, especially for the underprivileged and dispossessed in a government hospital. So may I request Dr. Gopalakrishnan to speak, and then I will introduce the second speaker, Professor Arpana Iyengar. Professor Gopalakrishnan.
Sure. Very good evening to one and all. Respected Professor Jaji, thanks very much for the kind introduction. Jaji sir has always been a source of great inspiration for me. He has been a beacon of hope for hundreds and thousands of kidney failure patients. The way he has envisioned and executed subsidized cost dialysis programs in the city of Chennai has been first of its kind, and subsequently it stimulated so many others to follow suit. In fact, it served as a model for the government also to take up some of the initiatives. Kudos to Tanker Foundation, particularly Jaji sir. Mrs. Lata, thanks for inviting me to be the speaker, and respected President IFKF and Arpana. The topic I have chosen, actually kidney transplantation for a common man. It is a success story of the Tamil Nadu. Let me start with a brief clinical scenario, the story of one underprivileged person. Mr. K, he was in the middle age of his life, the Pani Puri vendor. He was just not even a shop. No, it was just, he was selling Pani Puri in the streets adjoining Madras Medical College. Though he was from underprivileged background, he was a happy man with a nice family with 3 children. Suddenly, disaster struck on the family. He developed fatigue and lack of appetite and subsequently nausea and vomiting. He didn't bother much. Subsequently, when there was a further worsening of the general condition, it occurred to him to get admitted in Rajiv Gandhi Hospital Hospital. There was a diagnosis of chronic kidney disease in him, which was a rude shock for the family. He got admitted in nephrology services. This is the new nephrology block. It was my vision and dream. I've been heading the division of nephrology from 2011. Initially, we were running the department in 2 floors in other block. With more and more of influx of patients, we were running short of space, and we approached the government, and the government sanctioned one exclusive block, ground plus 8 floors for kidney, both nephrology and urology. We are occupying 4 floors with more than 150 beds. Fine. He was in fairly advanced chronic kidney disease with the contracted kidneys. There was no doubt in the diagnosis. We started him on dialysis. This is a maintenance dialysis unit which was initiated, which was installed in the year 2013. Before that, we didn't have a maintenance dialysis program at all in the state. We were able to do dialysis only for 2 sets of patients, one with acute kidney injury until the kidney starts functioning, the other one ESRD with a available living related kidney donor. But there was a vast majority of patients with chronic kidney disease going in for ESRD, but no donor in the family. In all of them, the pronouncement of the diagnosis of chronic kidney disease was almost equivalent to a pronouncement of a death sentence. So in 2013, we established a maintenance dialysis unit with the help of a philanthropist to start with, and then government came forward to help me out. This gentleman was on dialysis and he got registered for disease donor transplant because there was no suitable donor in the family. Fortunately, in less than a year, he got a kidney. He received a disease donor transplant in our institution. He received a low dose, single dose, 1 milligram per kg of ATG induction, followed by a triple immunosuppression, prednisolone, mycophenolate mofetil, and tacrolimus. But he had a mild delayed graft function to start with, and then subsequently, on day 10 or so, his creatinine touched 1.2 milligram per deciliter and got discharged. There was no major setbacks after that, but for an episode of CNI toxicity resulting in a mild graft dysfunction at 6 months post-transplant, then which improved after titration, down titration of CNI. Touch wood, he's doing so well so far till today with very well preserved graft function. Briefly, I'll tell about the journey of kidney transplant program in Madras Medical College. The first transplant was started in 1986, but it was not a regular one. The regular living related donor transplant program was initiated by my mentor, Professor Murthy Sethupathi, in the year 1987, but it was only living related donor. The first disease donor transplant took place in 1996 when I was a trainee in the same department. In fact, I was a transplant postgraduate. I did the bedside duty for the first disease donor transplant recipient in the same department where I'm heading now. The unique feature of the entire program of renal replacement therapy in Tamil Nadu government medical college hospitals is that the entire program, the dialysis, the pre-transplant workup, the transplant surgery, and more importantly, the lifelong post-transplant immunosuppression, everything is provided free of charges, right? So far we have done about 1,560 transplants for the past couple of years. Because of the COVID pandemic, there was a slump in the program. Otherwise, we could have done more. So these are the unique features. I said it is totally provided free of charges. So these are the milestones. Initially, in 1998, the immunosuppression was only steroid and azathioprine. We were able to give cyclosporine only for very few patients, like second transplant, the spousal transplant, and spousal donor transplant, and so on, because cyclosporine was so expensive, it was not available. From 1999 onwards, we started getting regular cyclosporine. In 2007, tacrolimus came into picture. In 2008, MMF we started using freely. In 2011, induction immunosuppression also was procured and provided free of cost by the government. So how it is possible for the government? It is because of a wonderful arrangement called Tamil Nadu Medical Services Corporation, TNMSC. There is a central procurement of immunosuppressives. The government in one window of purchase and supplies the medications across the state wherever it is required. And the current annual budget's less than 2 crores of rupees. Please look at the price at which they procured. The tacrolimus 1 milligram tablet, less than 4 rupees, and mycophenolate mofetil 500 milligram tablet, less than 10 rupees. So this is the advantage of central procurement, right? A few words about how we made a progress in disease donor transplant. As I've already said, the first disease donor transplant took place in 1996, but there was no momentum. It was happening just here and there once in a while, and very few institutions were doing it. And there is not much of like awareness about the program, both among the public as well as the medical professionals. And there was no definite government rules and no coordinating body. All that changed in the year 2008. 2008 is a landmark year in the story of disease donor transplant, wherein the government of Tamil Nadu plunged into the program and initiated a formal official program. It announced disease donor transplant as a flagship program of government of Tamil Nadu. It promulgated a series of government orders. All these, the government orders, the purpose of all these orders to ensure a transparency and to streamline the whole lot of the procedure and to coordinate the public and private institutions and to incorporate all the stakeholders into one umbrella and govern the entire thing, entire procedure. These are the 7 government orders. Each one is with a purpose. The first one is the most important one. The government made declaration of brain death made mandatory, particularly in the city hospitals of Chennai, so that people get used to certifying brain death. Even if the patient's relatives are not willing to donate, the brain death certification has been made mandatory. And subsequently, the GOs, which laid down the procedures for declaration of brain death, formulation of authorization committee and authorization committee procedures, and the allocation of organs, and how to do postmortem examination in medical legal cases, and so on. The last one is that even a hospital where the transplant program is not there, a non-transplant center also can get a permission to retrieve organs from brain death certified deceased donor. Fine. Then another leap in the program is that in 2014, there was further regularization and augmentation of the program, and there was a formulation of something called TransTan, Transplant Authority of Tamil Nadu. It is a semi-autonomous body. It was formed in 2014, and the ex officio chairman is the Honorable Chief Minister, and the member secretary is a senior medical professional. And the function of this TransTan is to oversee the conduct of the entire program, right? Tamil Nadu, we have 37 districts with a population of about 7.78 crores. And there are 32 medical colleges. It is the only Indian state where there is a maximum number of medical colleges, government medical colleges. And hemodialysis facility is available in all the medical colleges hospitals. Not just that, also in the district headquarters hospitals and taluk headquarters hospitals. Everything is provided free of cost. And there is presence of qualified nephrologists in 18 medical colleges. And in these centers, now we have transplant program. Even though it was initially started in Madras Medical College, the other city colleges followed suit, and subsequently Madurai, Tirunelveli, Coimbatore, and so on. The last 4 centers have just started. They haven't picked up momentum. In the near future, they will do more. So currently, I'll tell about something. It is CMCHIS, that is Chief Minister's Comprehensive Health Insurance Scheme. It is a very novel idea. All the people who are below poverty line, not just below poverty line, with the lower income families will be kind of enrolled into this insurance program, and the premium will be paid by the government. And for all the diseases, for each disease, there is a fixed amount. That money will be paid by the government, by the insurance company to the hospital where the treatment is happening. The premium also will be paid by the government. So this is called CMCHIS. It is a grand success model of Tamil Nadu. Most of the diseases, particularly kidney diseases, including dialysis and kidney transplant, both living related as well as disease donor transplant, are covered under this insurance scheme. Subsequently, recently, a couple of years ago, there is a central government program. There is a Prime Minister's insurance scheme, which is called PMJ. That also got incorporated, and now CMCHIS and the PMJ got integrated, right? Under this scheme, there are 12 government centers and 44 private hospitals are empaneled. Why private hospitals? Because, you know, the huge workload, and only the government institutions cannot cater to the needs of so many CKD patients. So the private hospitals which are willing to get empaneled under this insurance scheme are also welcome, and they got empaneled. So a person who is enrolled under the CMCHIS can get a free transplant or a free dialysis even in a private hospitals if it is empaneled under this scheme. Let me talk about our experience of kidney transplant. I said about underprivileged, transplant for underprivileged. Most of the beneficiaries of the transplant program in our institutions are farmers, construction workers, the small scale vendors, those who are working in road laying, furnaces, brick kilns, and semi-rural and semi-urban and rural areas. Most of them are in the prime part of their life. There are 2 major etiologies for chronic kidney disease in our department. One is the diabetes, and the second one, which is just surpassing diabetes, is the CKDU, chronic kidney disease of undetermined etiology. Our transplant program, since the beneficiaries of our transplant program are different from the beneficiaries of the same program from the Western world, and even in our own country, from a corporate hospital, the beneficiaries of our hospitals are different. So there are unique challenges and unique problems which we face. All the subsequent slides, I'm just going to discuss about them only one after the other. This is our publication of disease donor transplantation. We analyzed our survival data. Not bad. 1 year survival in disease donor transplant is 83.7, whereas the living related donor is much higher than that. The 5-year survival is 76.4. It can still improve. Okay. And another major development happened after a couple of years, that is, a government passed order for provision of free immunosuppressives lifelong for those who underwent transplant in a private hospital also. There are some patients, middle class patients, you know, like they sell off all their properties and they go to a corporate hospital and spend a lot of money and get a transplant. But subsequently, they run short of money to get the organ-saving immunosuppressive therapy. As per the initial government order, those patients who are availing transplant in the government institutions only will get lifelong immunosuppression, but this also has been changed now. This is a welcome change. The 2 major challenges which we face in our transplant program are, number 1, infections, number 2, non-compliance to immunosuppressives. This is one of our observations, a study from Madras Medical College. 53% of the patients have at least 1 infection during the first 6 months post-transplant, and 79% of the patients had at least 1 episode of infection during a mean follow-up of 43.5. So this is the magnitude of the infections in our patients. As you can see here, infection is the major cause of death. It contributes to about 52%. The graft dysfunction comes next, 33%. The coronary artery disease and cardiac, CVAs and other causes contributes only 15% of the causes. Whereas in the Western world, the number one killer is coronary artery disease, cardiovascular disease. So the infections, it is the bacterial sepsis, fungal sepsis. These are the two major ones, and then subsequently CMV, cytomegalovirus, tuberculosis, HCV, and so on. And the infections have been a significant contributor, not just to morbidity, but also mortality. And also, it is a negative determinant of the graft survival as well. So comparison of the data from Madras Medical College with that of USRDS. Look at the percentage of the people who die with a functioning graft, right? 18 versus 80%. So this is, the infection is a huge problem for us. We also studied impact of acute kidney injury on renal allograft survival, published in Renal Failure. We analyzed all the causes for acute kidney injury in graft. Look at this, infections contributed for 47% of the acute kidney injury. So that is the numero uno cause for acute kidney injury in a transplant recipient. Not just, see, this is the variety of infections starting from urosepsis, pneumonia, TMB, acute diarrheal disease, and so on. Look at the point I would like to highlight is that infections is one of the risk factors for progression to chronic kidney disease. Once infection associated acute decline in the graft function happens, it is one of the risk factors for propagation, for perpetuation of the injury in the graft, culminating in chronic graft dysfunction. Tuberculosis, the national disease. We have a significant problem of tuberculosis, not just in ESRD patients on dialysis, but also in transplant. This is our observation. The incidence is about 9.5%. A significant number of them is extrapulmonary. And there are two peaks in incidence, one around 1 year and one around 72 months. This is one of our patients, a bone marrow biopsy, where you can see the caseating granuloma. Sometimes, the diagnosis, making a diagnosis of tuberculosis in a kidney transplant recipient is very challenging, very atypical presentation, just weight loss, just diarrhea, just lack of appetite and fatigue, or PUO-like picture. All the tests will be negative. So in one such instances, we went ahead doing a bone marrow study which revealed a caseating granuloma. Then move on to systemic fungal infections. This is one of the publications in transplant proceedings. Again, our own experience of Madras Medical College. As you can see here, the systemic fungal infections contributed for 6.9% of the total infections, and Candida was the commonest fungus. Anti-rejection therapy was the most significant factor. So this is another unfortunate patient's renal allograft biopsy, which shows the septate slender hyphae of Aspergillus. He succumbed to it. An atypical presentation of Aspergillus is presented as an epidural abscess in a young lady whose serum creatinine was just 1 milligram. This is another patient of ours where you can see the angioinvasive mucor in renal allograft. Moving on to cytomegalovirus. The cytomegalovirus also is one of the formidable challenges our transplant recipients face, particularly the anti-rejection therapy and induction immunosuppressive therapy. These are the risk factors. The incidence of cytomegalovirus disease in about 10 to 15% of our transplant recipients have that one. This is yet another patient where there is the budding and pseudohyphal forms of Candida. And being a tropical country, we have to be aware of certain infections which are not encountered in the Western world, not mentioned in the Western textbooks. For instance, there is a high incidence of scrub typhus in the northern Tamil Nadu. This is one of our patients, kidney transplant recipient, fever, quickly went in for altered sensorium. And there was a travel to Ambur or Viluppuram, and then there was a shower in the patient, and it was a scrub typhus meningitis, and patient was successfully treated. Hepatitis C virus used to play a major havoc in the years. Many of them used to die with liver failure, but with functioning graft, because the only treatment available was interferon, and interferon in a transplant recipient will precipitate acute rejection. So we were not able to treat it, but now it is very easy to treat. There is availability of directly acting antiviral drugs, again, which is freely available, provided free of cost. So it is not a major issue at all nowadays. So this is one of our patients' image, which got a place in the cover page of Clinical Journal of the American Society of Nephrology. The CMV infection resulting in the graft dysfunction, as you can see here, the inclusion body allograft. The multidermatomal herpes zoster. The problem is that it causes a lot of morbidity, not just that. The acyclovir, which is the drug of choice, is potentially nephrotoxic. Diarrhea is a major problem. This is one of our publications. A study of 618 diarrheal episodes, of which 57% of the diarrheal episodes were due to infectious etiology. The increased net immunosuppression and anti-rejection therapy were the significant risk factors. This is cryptosporidium in one of our patients. It's very difficult to eradicate and treat. We treat with nitazoxanide. This is giardiasis and microsporidia in one of our patients, which is detected by modified trichrome stain. We have wonderful clinical pathology services in our department. And this is strongyloid stercoralis. It is very difficult to treat, and sometimes it causes wasting syndrome, a progressive weight loss and chronic diarrhea. The drug of choice is ivermectin. This is one of our patients' stool sample. And IRGN, now there is increased incidence of IRGN. It does not spare graft also. Very unfortunate in one of our patients with normally functioning graft, 6 years post-transplant, he developed an impetiginous lesions and subsequently developed a post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, IRGN. This is the electron microscopy picture showing the subepithelial hump. He went in for graft dysfunction. The prognosis of IRGN in renal allograft, in our experience, is very, very poor. So why I projected so many series of infections of personal experience of our department is that we personally feel that the population whom we are catering to, they are unique, and we need to tailor immunosuppressive therapy for our patients, particularly in South Asia, particularly in India, and particularly the beneficiaries in a government setup. It has to be different. That's what we feel. What are the differences in general about the continent of Asia? There is higher population density compared to most other parts of the world, low economic status and literacy rate is poor, body weight is less, nutritional status is poor, and low health budget in most of the Asian countries. And there are many infections which are endemic in most of the countries, including India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so on. It is tuberculosis. Not just that. The ethnic differences in the pharmacokinetics of the immunosuppression also is there. Particularly the pharmacokinetics of MMF is different in Asians. It has been demonstrated that the higher mycophenolic acid exposure happens for a given dose of mycophenolate mofetil for the same dose which a Caucasian receives versus Asian receives. The exposure of the Asian patient to mycophenolic acid is more. There are many factors which determine these ethnic differences in the pharmacokinetics of mycophenolate mofetil, including body weight, diet, environment, and enterohepatic circulation of mycophenolic acid glucuronide, and more importantly, the genetic differences, which we call it as pharmacogenetics. It is a well-known fact that there are many single nucleotide polymorphisms of genes which are involved in MMF pharmacokinetics, particularly UGT1A9 and MRP2. So, according to an observation, 20 to 46% lesser than that in the Caucasians. The requirement of MMF in Asians, actually the dose requirement may be lesser than that in the Caucasians and African Americans, ranging anywhere between 20 to 46%. So this has to be borne in mind. We cannot just apply the same dose of immunosuppressive as it is being practiced in the Western world. And many strategies which we have adopted in our institution, Number one, we don't give induction immunosuppression for all patients. Only for the disease donor transplants, we give the lymphocyte depleting ATG and highly sensitized recipients and recipients of the living donor kidneys with the 2 haplotype HLA match. And for this living related donor kidney, we give lymphocyte non-depleting, that is basiliximab induction. And for the patients for whom we give ATG, we give low dose, single dose, 1 milligram per kilogram. That's all. And MMF dosing, we go by body weight. A starting dose will be 12 milligram per kg twice daily. And the CMC value has shown that we have to titrate the dose to achieve a target AUC of mycophenolic acid of about 45 milligram hour per liter, but this facility is not available with us. And similarly, the dose of calcineurin inhibitors and steroids, our dosing regimen is much lesser as compared to even to a corporate hospital in Chennai city itself. And another important thing I was talking about, the second major problem, the non-adherence. The non-adherence problem is a real problem. This is a study done in our own department, a study of about 279 patients with a mean follow-up of 56 months. Non-adherence was as high as 26.5%, which posed a high risk of rejection, 4-fold higher risk for acute rejection. Actually, it requires a lot of scrutiny, and it is an issue worthy of even doing a PhD research. Normally, the non-adherence, the major determinant in other parts of the world is the cost. But here, the recipients of transplant in our state, actually they get immunosuppression free of charges, free of cost. But still it is happening. So we are trying so many the tricks and strategies to mitigate this problem, but still it is a burning issue. So these are the barriers to stick on to immunosuppressives that was studied, starting from the too many doses at once, and lack of conviction about whether the medicines are working or not. All these, these were all the determinants. They were all studied systematically. One thing what happens is that, when there is a successful engraftment and the serum creatinine remains around 1 milligram, after about an year, there is an element of complacency. They try to skip a dose or a couple of doses, and they see the creatinine. If nothing happens, they get emboldened, and that's how the story goes on. But now we are adopting very novel and newer strategies. In a couple of years from now on, I think we'll be able to get out of this problem. Fine. And not just these infections and the non-adherence, there are certain non-infectious complications as well. There's a very high prevalence of hypertension in transplant recipients. Multiple reasons. One important reason is that massive weight gain to the tune of 20 to 25 kilograms in 1 year after transplant itself, in addition to other things. And we have a series of patients with the transplant renal artery stenosis who present with accelerated hypertension, hypokalemia, and so on. And erythrocytosis, about 15.5% of our patients have that. And my talk will not be over if I don't mention about our experience of the COVID infection in kidney transplant recipients. This is one of our published experience. The first wave, in the middle of the first wave itself, we published. So this is a study of only about 42 kidney transplant recipients with a mortality of 14.5%. The graft dysfunction was observed in about 52% of the patients. But this, the first wave, the impact of the COVID on the graft was not huge. But look at this. This is a total compilation of our experiences of about 130 and odd patients, first wave and second wave. I draw your attention to the sharp difference in the mortality rate of the first wave and second wave, 12.5% versus 30.2%. The second wave was really horrific. Most of the patients with well-functioning graft, they just came and they didn't even give adequate time to react, and they just died. That is a Delta variant. And the unit policy was the milder forms of the COVID, nothing need to be done regarding immunosuppression. Moderate and severe, the down titration of immunosuppression be proceeded with. To start with, the reduction of the antimetabolite and subsequently CNI and so on. And oral prednisolone was converted to injection dexamethasone. And in most of them, new onset diabetes happened, and those who are already having NODAT, there was a worsening of hyperglycemia also happened. It was real horrific experience of COVID and this thing. Fine. So this is the photograph taken in our campus. We always feel, even though sometimes we do get setbacks, there's always something to cherish. Our program has been progressive. Every month we do about 3,200 dialysis. We have about 70 dialysis machines. With 4 floors, we have more than 150 beds and so on. We are able to cater to the needs of more and more of underprivileged people with various renal syndromes, including acute kidney injury and intensive renal care unit and chronic maintenance dialysis and disease donor transplant, living related donor transplant, continuous ambulatory peritoneal dialysis, even CRRT and so on. This is one of the photographs taken in the early years, 2012, in the World Kidney Day. The youngest transplant recipient and the oldest ones, and the one who survives for more than 3 decades and so on. We keep telling the patients who are in despair that there is certainly a beautiful light at the end of every tunnel, however long it may be. So this is the frontage of the third block, the COVID block of our hospital, which used to be bombarded with hundreds of ambulances during the peak of second COVID. Now it is so serene and calm and silent. So this is a picture taken when the 1,500th kidney transplant recipient of our institution receiving felicitations from our beloved Dean on World Kidney Day in 2011. Thank you so much for listening to my lecture. Thank you so much.
Professor Gopalakrishnan,
Yes,
it
sir.
has been an amazing journey, and you have shown it very clearly that in a government setup, you could do so many things with a leadership and comprehensive team. And this shows that most of the data you have shown is your own rather than Western data or Eastern data or that from developed countries. This gives you immense strength in taking your transplant program forward. And we are all humbled by your presentation. And it has been a great journey. And I congratulate you. And I wish you all the best that many of our patients benefit from your support for their immunosuppressive medication. And you have highlighted about the infections. Infection is the major cause of transplant death in our country, not cardiovascular disease. I'm so much amazed by the way you have presented it. And thank you so much. I'm sure that many people who are watching you all over the world would see the value of your presentation and the value of your work. And I hope that Almighty God gives you long life to take this forward and to train many youngsters in a government hospital and to understand the intricacies of kidney care in a government hospital, especially transplantation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Hello. Hello.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, Gopalakrishnan. If there are any questions, Gopalakrishnan will be able to answer, but I don't think that we need to ask any questions because everything was lucid.
Thank you so much, sir.
So can we move on to the next presentation? I have great pleasure in introducing Tanker CME committee member, Professor Arpana Iyengar. She is the head of the Department of Pediatric Nephrology at St. John's Hospital. This is not a government facility, but it is a not-for-profit organization. And her clinical work, research, and educational activities and outdoor activities through the St. John's Hospital has been a landmark achievement for many. And Professor Arpana Iyengar has many publications to her credit and also edited textbooks. And she has been closely attached with the National Society of Nephrology as a member to take things forward in pediatric nephrology. And I have known Arpana for many years, and she has been a recipient of not only Professor Gopalakrishnan, Arpana Iyengar has been a recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award by the Tanker Foundation many years ago. And she continues to educate people, and she is an icon of hope for pediatric nephrology in this country. Atuna, please go ahead with your talk.
Thank you, sir. That was a really generous introduction. Good evening. First of all, thank you very much to the IFKF WKA, Professor S.F. Louis, Dr. George Abraham, for giving me this opportunity, especially to share a stage with such an eminent nephrologist and speaker and teacher like Dr. Gopalakrishnan. So, what I'm going to do today is to give you a panoramic view of kidney transplantation in children with a special focus across low middle income and low income countries. And I would just say in one sentence that all that one needs to do and strive to make this happen is what you heard in Dr. Gopalakrishnan's talk. So we're going to focus on the differences and gaps that exist in pediatric kidney transplantation in these underserved or under-resourced regions. So if we ask ourselves, what is so different in kidney transplantation in these regions, we have a long list under the spotlight, starting from ESKD care itself to accessibility to transplantation, transplant outcomes, capacity building, donor pool issues, economic and non-economic barriers, and so on. First and foremost, let's step on to the most important issue, that is kidney failure care. And if you can see here, the late presentation in most children is a big challenge. That is, we have at least 25% of kids who present in late stages for the first time. And they come with such bad comorbidities that we just can't stabilize them or prepare them for transplantation. We have published a study highlighting the comorbidities that are clearly seen to be higher than the large Western cohort of CKID study, that is the large CKD, pediatric CKD registry study, except for obesity, of course. That is the story of a center from India, but what happens in a low-income region like Sub-Saharan Africa? With the mortality rate being high and limited access to dialysis, you can see that the patients transplanted are 19%, and these are children. And you can also see that quarter of them actually are lost to follow-up. A recent paper from Nigeria has mentioned that they have a diagnosis of 400 to 500 new ASKD patients every year in children, and less than 0.2% get transplanted. So this is clearly an issue, and we have a retrospective study done on the outcomes of children with kidney failure from our center. Out of 155 with kidney failure, you can see that 65 were lost to follow, a huge issue for us. And you can also see that 58% were not transplanted and 30 were transplanted, that is just 20%. So we have just 20% of all the children who present with ESKD actually going ahead with transplantation. Now, among those who were not transplanted, if we look at few families, they were actually planning for transplantation. They wanted their children to get transplanted. But what was the issue? Though there was compatibility, ABO compatibility, the donors, being fathers, were not really willing to donate. And some of them, of course, went ahead and registered themselves in the diseased organ program. The other issue was there were no compatible donors, and then some of them again were directed to diseased organ registration. And very few of them had no living donors available, but were not interested to go and register in the diseased organ program. So here we have several such issues. Now, in the families who did not want to even plan for kidney transplantation, majority of them were just not interested in pursuing. And of course, some of them had genuine reasons like dense deposit disease, primary hyperoxaluria, which are quite difficult and challenging issues when it comes to transplantation in children. And urological issues that were unresolved were also in the list that made it difficult for families to take that decision. So after 2 decades as a referral transplant center in India, we as an academic institution, non-profit private institution, continue to transplant only 20% of all pediatric ASKDs. Loss to follow-up is a common problem which results in presumed death in the majority. Why I say this is many of them may not be even going to a place that can offer them free care because the facilities are not available. And I'll allude to this in a bit. So what determined the continuation of treatment in this 46% of kids? So these families, how did they decide to continue ESKD care? Only then they will get on to dialysis or transplantation at some point in time. So besides the socio-economic factors that are, and financial factors that are expected, interestingly, we found that access to treatment, that is distance from the center and time taken to travel, were important determinants in looking at how families decided to continue treatment. So the farther they went, lost to follow-up. So that brings us to an important issue of access to transplantation. And you can see here, this is from the GKHA Atlas. And this is the data from South Asia. Most of the countries in South Asia do have transplantation programs. I'm talking about the adult transplantation programs here, except Bhutan. But the unfortunate fact is that though all these countries have transplantation program going on actively, there are no national transplant registries except in Bangladesh. Taking a snapshot of the pediatric renal transplant scene in India, we conducted a survey, a national survey, and this is what we observed. 62% of adult nephrologists and 67 pediatric nephrologists actually undertake transplant in children. And we have only 3 government institutions offering pediatric renal transplantation. So this is the issue that I was highlighting a few minutes back, wherein academic institutions and private corporate hospitals have all the facilities to offer transplantation. The cost is anywhere between 4 to 10 lakhs, depending on the institution. But if there are families who cannot afford, families that Dr. Gopalakrishnan was describing to us, what would these families do if we would want to refer them to a government setup where they will be eligible for free treatment? Most of the government institutions don't even have the expertise to continue dialysis care in children, leave alone transplantation. So that is a major barrier. Our observations also reveal low rates of preemptive transplantation in children, and very few centers undertake more than 5 transplants per year. I will not be doing justice if I do not highlight the amazing work that Gujarat government is doing in terms of pediatric transplantation. This is snap from the Institute of Kidney Disease and Research, Ahmedabad, Gujarat. This is one of our DM residents in pediatric nephrology who graduated from our institution and went on to Ahmedabad and is making a huge difference by undertaking pediatric transplantation. This is a kid who is less than 10 kgs, that means a low body weight transplant. And the fantastic work that the government is doing, the load of pediatric transplantations a government set up institution is undertaking is amazing. They even conducted 45 transplants during the COVID pandemic. And all this is free of cost. So they have a school health program in every district in Gujarat. And those kids who need dialysis, who need transplantation, are just taken care of totally free of cost, lifelong. Amazing. So whatever I speak is obviously from an academic private institution, but the scene in a government setup, this could be a prototype for other government institutions to look at for children. Looking at medical barriers, a study from UK reveals that disease factors, donor availability, and the size of the child were barriers for transplantation in children. But in our retrospective study, we found out many other reasons that came in the way of transplantation, like inadequate access to disease donation in our state, unresolved bladder issues, which is a very common, because the most common cause for ESRD in children is CACUT. No multi-organ transplantation in those who need it, high risk of recurrence because many of them have FSGS, and inadequate expertise with the recipient high sensitization in the recipient. Transplant outcomes and medical issues are very important points that we need to look at across low and middle income countries. But looking at what is the most ideal is the NAPRETUS data, and you have the graft survival rates of 99, 97, 95% at 1, 3, and 5 years. And this is a list of all the developing countries, I should say. You look at the first 1 year graft survival, quite good, comparable to the NAPRETUS data. But as you go along, 5 year, 10 year, the graft survival rates do come down. So that is again an important challenge for us in these regions. If we look at the most common problem that causes ESKD in children, that is CACUD with lower urinary tract dysfunction, the Australian New Zealand data shows that a 20-year graft survival is poor in these kids. But in contrast to that, the Argentina experience says that it's quite good compared to the non-CACUD children who are transplanted. Our experience again says that the children with abnormal lower urinary tract have definitely lesser survival in the long term. Acute rejection is a small problem in the West, but in most of the LMICs and LICs, as you can see here, it ranges between 20 to 60%. And the data on this acute rejection on diseased transplantation comes from Thailand, Turkey, and Chile. If I have to pick two important post-transplant issues in children, it will be post-transplant infections and urinary tract infections top the list. Of course, we were fortunate that COVID did not really attack our kids post-transplant, though a few of them just got admitted for very mild symptoms. And we were really fortunate not to have any major problems with our transplanted kids. Tuberculosis is an issue in some regions. And it's not only the infections, but diagnostic facilities, availability of viral load monitoring, availability of vaccine efficacy, all these are major issues still in our setups. The second problem is suboptimal growth. Now, children as they grow, they are not too keen on knowing their creatinine alone post-transplant, but also want to know their height. Have I grown a few centimeters from my last visit? And then we try to persuade them to wear heels so that they can catch up, they can look taller. But it is a psychological problem that children don't like to look stunted. And of course, we don't follow any of these free steroid-free protocols for various reasons. And therefore, we have most of our kids having a reduced height velocity post-transplant. But those who are transplanted more than 12 years of age definitely have a better height velocity compared to younger children. Coming to the donor pool, we have a few centers in India, the one in Ahmedabad and some other countries like Thailand and Brazil, who have established well-diseased organ programs in children and who report quite comparable graft survival rates. The SOTO, State Organ Tissue Transplant Organization, I'm just giving you the Karnataka state ratios of pediatric to adults. Can you just see this? 1 to 2 pediatric in terms of comparison to 200 to 300 adult recipients. This is the diseased organ program ratio of child to adult. And unfortunately, there is no priority for children in the state's diseased organ program. So our kids have to wait for years for their turn for a diseased organ. ABO incompatible transplantation has been undertaken successfully in a couple of private hospitals in India. Paired organ donation is not really something that on the pediatric side has been tried, but definitely it is probably being promoted as an ideal cost-effective modality of caring for ESKD patients in under-resourced nations. Highly sensitized transplantation, we just I'm not going to the details of this, but we just had a wonderful seminar a week back. Dr. Deshu Pulianda from Siddhar Sinai gave this talk, and because Siddhar Sinai Hospital is like the mecca for highly sensitized kidney transplantation, and she was sharing with us how they have protocols of rituximab, IVIG, tocilizumab, alemtuzumab, and she also mentioned interestingly IDUS, that is immunoglobulin degrading enzyme from Streptococcus pyogenes. Now this IDUS is at present not available in the market, she said, but it's got a very fascinating mechanism that it cleaves the FAB and FC filaments in the immunoglobulin and makes it totally inactive. So you see the HLA antibodies get reduced or get knocked off with IDUS. It's called imlifidase, and there are many studies in the recent years in adults, but she was telling us that this could be the future for highly sensitized children. Well, that's a bit of good news from the high-income countries. Coming to the economic barriers, which again is the ground reality for us, I must say that when we are preparing our families for transplantation, and more than 50% of them, I would say even 70 to 80% of them, we got to handhold them. We raise funds, we get donations, and we help them only if they are really motivated. And there is a fantastic team of our paramedical staff, from the nutritionist to social worker to transplant coordinator to HDPD nurses, who strive to get this family get prepared, not only medically, but in other aspects for transplantation. And we have completed for 96 transplants till date. It's not only the finance. If you look at, this is a study that we undertook, looking at what are the reasons that families give us in terms of not going ahead with transplant or refusing transplant. And very interesting to see that most of them just hope for miraculous recovery. They believe that God will cure the child. And others report that elders in the family, others in the family are ill, or there's another sibling who is coming into the family. So the focus gets diverted. And there's basically denial, poor awareness of CKD itself. Sometimes paternal decision making. We have seen that the father decides and the mother may be having her own perspectives, but she doesn't get a chance to share that. So there are very difficult choice making process that we observe in these families. There are negative attitudes towards organ donation. So there's a lot of work to be done besides just the sorting out the medical issues. It's not only with us. The ground realities that I would share here is from Durban and Burma. These are centers that have undertaken Sister Transplant Center program under the ISN, and they successfully transplanted kids. And after transplantation, when they went back to home visits to look at how these kids were handled at home, they were quite shocked because they found that these children had not enough space at home to stay. They didn't have ideal, decent homes. They didn't have decent electricity or hygienic water supply. So many of these centers in under-resourced areas come up with a criteria that for transplantation, some of these social issues also need to be looked at, like access to clean water, electricity, space at home, transport, and so on. So I think this is another important message, that when we are transplanting kids in such under-resourced areas, we got to think of all these issues and not just go ahead, finish the surgery, and then leave the family to deal with the rest. So this is a illustration which clearly says that for a successful pediatric transplant program in under-resourced regions, we got to look at it in a very holistic way. Going to some other things that we, like Sir was mentioning, something to cherish always. Here is, the first row are our kids post-transplant. You can see they're of different sizes. And the second row is unique. And I think when you look at this photograph, I get a smile on my face. There's a very important message that this photograph conveys. The middle row you see, are all women, whether it's the mother or the grandmother, because they are the donors for the kidneys of their children or grandchildren. I'm not saying we've never had father donors, but I think definitely mothers come forward. We have maximum mothers as donors, and probably this is a good topic for an ethical discussion for some other day. I would also like to share a small story that will serve as a food for thought and no other purpose in this talk. There was a 3-year-old kid, my patient, who was diagnosed with steroid-resistant FSGS by biopsy. After 8 years, he went on to ESKD, was on dialysis, no living donor, and he was on the organ list for 6 years. At 17, when we were all getting ready to transit him into adult nephrology care, he got a call and he was thrilled. We were thrilled. We transplanted him and there was recurrence. Now, let me give you a background that this boy had his mother, he had single parent, the father was an alcoholic and he left home, and a younger brother. And the mother was a daily wage laborer. She was highly motivated. She raised funds for every dialysis session. This is very different from what Dr. Gopalakrishnan was mentioning about how Tamil Nadu government is supporting in dialysis for the underserved strata of society. Here, this individual mother, as a parent, went from pillar to post, went to various organizations. We helped her do that, but there was a lot of motivation from her side. Skipped her meals to save money because she had to keep 1,000 rupees for her son's dialysis every alternate day. And she trusted her doctor and her doctor team. When the diseased organ call came, she was overjoyed that the wait was over. All that she wanted was to get her son transplanted. And we had been very careful about informing her the possibility of recurrence. But despite that, she was very optimistic. No, I will do what I can do. And today the day has come. God has answered my prayers and I will go ahead. And we, mainly me, as a lead at that point in time of the department, supported her in her decision because I've seen him for 15 years and then I knew how this mother wanted her son to get transplanted badly. But finally, when the recurrence happened, we again strived for funds and we treated him. And then we had to transit him to adult because he crossed 18 and a half, 19. But with a very bad severe infection, he succumbed. And at the end of all this, I asked myself, have I done more harm than good to this young man and his family? Was I wrong in pushing a family with limited resources to undertake an expensive treatment that had no guarantee of success? Should I take the family's economic situation when I make a decision for a medical recommendation like transplantation? So I will just leave you with this question. There are no right and wrong answers, but when we're talking about underprivileged or underserved families and they don't have government or a public sector support or insurance, and they have to, everything is out of pocket expenditure. This is something a clinician who's taking care of a family would experience. We have other brighter side of the transplant journey in our institution. We have been a sister transplant center with Rome, Bambino Gesù Hospital, and it was not to undertake transplant, but to go ahead with many other milestones like capacity building, going ahead with low body weight transplantation, transplant pathology through telemedicine, donor lap nephrectomy for pediatric transplantation. And of course, we have also had the opportunity to train our transplant coordinators on the national front. I would close by again ending with some happy stories. This girl was transplanted in 6-7 years' time. Her parents came saying that we found a match and we would like you to speak to the would-be groom. And we did that. And it was a very different experience. We went for the wedding and blessed the couple. This boy, he had PUV, he was on CIC, he's still on CIC. He decided to get married. This girl came to us and we explained things to her. And the strong and bold couple went ahead. He came back with a small baby. He's got 2 children now. And then he wanted us to bless his kids. And that just proves that the cycle of life is complete. And we're happy that we are fortunate that we are a part of lives of such bold and amazing children. So truth be told, we have several issues. We have seen the ground reality of our needs, but one has to accept that progress towards solving elementary issues impacting child health should take place, and only then the kidney transplantation will be a success. Otherwise, kidney transplantation will remain a big challenge in the under-resourced regions. But looking at the brighter side, the multidisciplinary approach that the transplant program demands will always have a positive influence on the entire health system. So that's a positive aspect of having a transplant program in these under-resourced, low-resourced regions, or LMICs. And with that note, I conclude and thank Professor Georgie Abraham for giving me this wonderful opportunity. Thank you, Ms. Lata, also for inviting me. And I would wait if there's any questions. I'm happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Arpana Iyengar, for this fantastic and challenging journey you undertook over a period of many years, especially in treating children with chronic kidney disease. We all know that in 1991, when we started the PD program, we had children coming to us today. Yesterday, I was saying that we have a kid by name Kirti, boy, and we wanted to start. We started on peritoneal dialysis, and I still remember 30 years, nearly 30 years have gone, and we have taken the challenge, and the challenges are many, and you have shown a way to overcome those challenges through your presentation. Amazed by your presentation, the way you have taken. Regarding the ethics of that, the ethics vary between countries. We all know that. We have been to different countries. So an ethical challenge is different in developed country in Africa compared to ethical problem in our country. For example, I would say that Cameroon, we had fellows coming from Cameroon, which is a country, half of them speak English, the other half speaks French. Their longevity is only 52 years compared to, the other countries in the world. So can we say that, okay, anybody who is coming for dialysis at the age of 15, Cameroon should be denied dialysis? No, answer is not that. So we need to fight that together and take it forward. And there is no question of ethics and challenges we face. So one, I want to just highlight that. My patient who was in the school in 2020, she was transplanted. Arpana might know her that she became an MBBS doctor, then an MD doctor. She got married, and after 20 years, this is the second in the world. The first one is in Italian registry, 278 months. This is 20 years, that is 240 months after transplant, a successful conception and birth of a young boy. That boy is now almost 6 months. So these are all things which we never imagined a decade ago, but it is becoming possible, especially with children who are females who get transplant, they move forward and they have their academics, and then they do very well and they want to have a family, and we can never deny that they should get married. So this is how the life goes on. And thank you so much. Are there any questions to Dr. Arpana? Please.
Dr. Esif?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experience. I thank Kausi as well. I think it's good because one of the role of IFKF Working Alliance is for people in the renal community to meet and discuss. In fact, a lot of problem that you are faced with is not unique. It's worldwide problem, be it different in different part of the world. And just for your information, currently our interest is to promote more of this type of online webinar when everyone can share together. And in fact, we are launching a program called World Kidney Online. World Kidney Online. Partly it's also for healthcare professionals, but also in the future more so for patients as well, because so that we can share. I used to head one of the academic units in Hong Kong. I actually do a lot of kidney transplant as a nephrologist as well. And maybe I just share 2 points because I see a challenge is not unique. It's everyone have the same problem. Is to how to increase the chance of organ donation. You need more organ to transplant. And the other one is how to maintain the kidney transplant to survive longer, because it'd be a shame that they have a transplant and they die from other things. And I think you have the problem of infection, which is intrinsic to your problem already. So I can see a challenge. It's not going to be easy. Maybe I just share 2 personal experience in what I've done. I was the president of, you may be surprised, I've been president of Hong Kong Society of Nephrology. I've also been president of Hong Kong Society of Transplantation as well for many years. So I stepped on both sides of the world, so to speak. The kids, I just come back to the kids, what is fair in kidney allocation. Some 30 years ago, I was in charge of the whole program, and we come to we need to make decision how to allocate kidneys fairly and equitably among all the things. I actually convinced all the nephrologists, everyone in Hong Kong, that we come up with a proposal of everyone on the transplant waiting list on a computer. They'll be scored. And what was the fair score for everyone? I show you what we did agree to, which is stood 30 years. We say that you get a score form. First element is your age, 60 minus the age. Now, the reason I argue for that is we want a kidney to live as long as possible. Okay, it's just fair to, we don't want a kidney that go to, everyone deserves a kidney, but I think you probably agree if you're 70 years old and you've got a kidney, you may only last for 10 years. Whereas a kid with 10 years old might last for hopefully 20 years, 30 years. So we have equations that is 60 minus our age. So the kids got a lot of points. You see what I mean? Because they actually, age 10, they got 50 points already. And then we plus your number of years on dialysis times the factor to actually account for those who have been waiting for a long time. And then we got score for HLA matching and other things as well. I just want to share with you this equation, which I actually established some 30 years ago, still stood well in Hong Kong, and everyone applied for that. And the rationale is very clear: give the young people the optimum chance. So the kids in Hong Kong get quite a high priority because they got, compared to age 50 patients, 50 years old, 60 minus 50 is only got 10 points, but the kids is 10 years old got 50 points already. So so that's one thing maybe I just offer. You may think about that. I know it's always a difficult challenge. The second point I share very quickly. I do a lot of organ donation promotion, which is a challenge. I saw that you also got transplant coordinator as well. I don't know what is your success rate to get deceased organ donation from brainstem death, but Hong Kong is not easy. It's not been easy at all. But let me share with you one thing which I did 3 years ago is in Hong Kong, some people get, when they die, they get cremated. They get, and you can scatter your ash. So one of the cemetery that is in Hong Kong, I managed to get them to donate a very large, we call this garden of love in these places. Okay, so if we there we have a memorial wall, and we honor every single donor with a plaque. And actually that's a great relief to the families as well. They feel that they've been acknowledged, and then their kindness have been recorded forever. So maybe I just offer you these 2 things which I've done in Hong Kong. What is the fair allocation of kidneys, and that's how we look at it. The second thing is how to actually acknowledge the donor family in this way.
Lata, are you there?
No, Dr. Lata seems to have dropped out. I think the power went off. She's in Kotagiri.
So I think that we come to a close, and we should thank all Kausi, thank you for arranging these wonderful two scientists about talking about pediatric and adult transplantation. I think that we will have more of these sort of scientists to speak for our IFKF and CME programs. And thank you all, and good night. I think it is time for us to wind up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, doctor.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.